she was not worshiping. Verse 15, Naomi said, "Behold, thy sister has gone back into her people, and to her God return thou after thy sister-in-law." So Naomi recognized the situation that Ruth was in, that she had grown up in this environment and circumstance. And such a circumstance tends to invite more immorality. If you look at Romans, the first chapter, where where Paul talks about how God had revealed himself in his creation, and man had rejected that, and they turned to idols. And when they did so, God said God gave them up to all forms of immorality. And that's because they had no moral compass when they gave up God. And those in Moab, worshiping false gods, did not have that moral compass to guide them. And that's the kind of environment that Ruth grew up in. Ruth had a decision to make. Her husband had died. Naomi was the only, she had a family, obviously, but she was closer to Naomi, obviously, than she was her own family. The influence of Naomi was there. The decision that Ruth made was based on her relationship, really, with Naomi and the family that she had and her former husband. She had been with Naomi for some 10 years, and it's important to remember that during this time she was still in the circumstances of her homeland and of her environment. But when Naomi decided to go back to Israel, Ruth said, "I'm going with you." "No, you're not. You just stay here with your people." "No, I'm going with you." Now, what caused that kind of decision? You think about it. This was Ruth's country. This is where she grew up. This is where she lived. This is where her family was, or I guess her mother and father and so on. What would prompt a person to make that kind of decision in their life? To leave the land of their birth, to leave their family and friends, to settle in another country with people you don't know. You ever had to move? When you move from one place to another, I'm sure in our society today it says everybody moves every 7 years. Now, I don't know if that's true or not, but if you've ever had to move from one city to another, it's still in the United States, but is there kind of an anxiety there? Because you don't know people, right? You're not familiar. You don't know how to get to know people. There's an anxiety associated. Here was Ruth. She was moving to a foreign country that worshiped a different God, and that had times been enemies of Israel. And she sought to follow Naomi, who worshiped the one true God, rather than staying in the land in which she'd grown up that worshiped multiple gods. She had formed a bond with Naomi, and that was prompted her decision to stay. In fact, it probably was the only reason, the bond that she had with this person. Ruth's character had to have some part of that decision, obviously, her own character. But her own character, I think, was obviously formed by Naomi herself. Ruth was a woman who we would call a good woman. And that's our way of talking in this day. We would call her a good woman. She's obviously a woman who wasn't a thief or a murderer. She had a heart that was evidently open to the truth. But that's only a part of the answer. Ruth herself. She was a good person, and she followed Naomi into Israel. But at that time, there wasn't any kind of mass exodus from Moab of good people to Israel. There wasn't such a thing. Truth, the people of Moab they understood God. They understood Jehovah. They were not ignorant of the God of Israel. In no way. They understood. They knew the God of Israel. They just didn't believe. But there was no mass exodus to go into Israel. So Ruth was the only person that we have any record of in this particular instance. And also we have the idea that Oprah, her sister-in-law, had decided herself to turn back. But if you think about it, even though she had decided to turn back, it took a lot of persuasion to get her to go, didn't it? She didn't just say, she said, I'll go with you. Naomi says, no. And she said, well, I'll just turn around and go. No, she didn't do that. Naomi almost had to take a stick to her to get her to go back. Because that's the kind of influence that Naomi had. And that's where the answer lies when we ask the question, why did Ruth make this kind of decision? If Naomi had been a hateful woman, if she'd have been a mean woman, would Ruth have made that kind of decision? Would we tend to do that? Do we tend to listen to and want to follow people who are mean and hateful? We don't do that, and neither would Ruth, certainly. If Naomi had been just indifferent to Ruth, just because, well, you know what, I know she married my son, but she's a Moabitist, and I'm just not going to really have that much to do with her. Just she could come to my house, but that's about it. She didn't have that kind of attitude, obviously. Naomi didn't. And if she had been that kind of person, you think Ruth would have made that decision? I wouldn't want to follow somebody like that. And if Naomi had been hypocritical in her responsibilities toward God, you think about that. If she had said, okay, I believe in Jehovah and this, but then she'd gone out and acted contrary to what what God taught and what the Scriptures taught, then I don't know. I don't want to follow a person that really doesn't know or want to, be true to their beliefs. Remember old Joshua, when on his farewell address, he told the people of Israel, says, look, you got to make up your mind. He wanted them to obey God, but he says, you make up your mind. If you want to go to the Amorites, go ahead and go and have done with it, is what he told them. That's what you need to do. You got to make up your mind. And if Naomi had not been that kind of person who made up her mind, but had been hypocritical in her responsibility to God, Naomi wouldn't have gone with her. Now, although when it comes to our relationship with other people, we very often base our feelings and actions on how we're treated by them. And that goes for us too. People are going to base how they feel about us on how we treat them. Isn't that true? Isn't that the case? So if Ruth literally begged Naomi to go with her and says, I'll go with you no matter what, and and as it says, I'm just not going to go back. Where you go, I'm going to go. Where you live, I'm going to live. Where your people are, they're going to be my people. And where you die, that's where I'm going to die. You think she would have done that if Naomi had treated her poorly and had been that kind of person toward her? We have a feeling about people normally based on how they treat us. And it's a good lesson there, a side lesson. People are going to, as I said, people are going to have their feelings about us based on how we treat them. So that's a good side lesson, a great side lesson. Although Naomi wasn't perfect, because she was a human being, and she was not perfect, she obviously lived a life that encouraged Ruth to make the kind of decision that she did. in a strange land. Naomi was in a strange land, had not been influenced by the pagan worship or the immorality that was around her. She had remained faithful and true to God. And in the 10 years plus that she knew Ruth and Orpah, her daughters-in-law, she had certainly had every opportunity to teach them. Do you think that that Ruth didn't know what Naomi believed? That Ruth had not taught her some of the law of God, and also her sister-in-law? She certainly had done that. In the most trying of circumstances that Naomi found herself, uprooted from her homeland and family, death of her husband and 2 sons, she had kept the faith. She had kept the law. She had been faithful to God. She had remained true to her beliefs. That's the kind of person that she was. The kind of influence that she had on her life. And I don't know this, but my guess is she had influence on her neighbors too and everything, didn't you think so? Yeah, that kind of influence can't just be, just myopic, that's it. She kind of had an influence upon the people that lived around her. I'm going to have to take a drink of water. Now the question is it a good thing for us to be like Naomi? You think it is? I think it's a great thing for us to be like Naomi. In Matthew, turn with me, Matthew the 5th chapter, in the Sermon on the Mount, verses 14 through 16. Beginning in verse 13, it says, "Ye are the salt of the earth, but if the salt hath lost its savor, wherewith shall it be salted? It is therefore good for nothing but be cast out and trodden under the foot of man. You are the light of the world, and a city set on a hill cannot be hid. Neither do men light a lamp and put it under a bushel, but on the stand, that it shines unto all that are in the house. Even so let your light shine before men, that they may see your good works and glorify your Father who is in heaven." Therein is the influence that we have in the world, like Naomi. We need to be like her. We need to have an influence on other people. We need to be a light to other people, that they can see us and they can see God because of the kind of people we are. This is what Jesus said. He said that they may they see you and the kind of person that you are, and by doing that, they may glorify your Father who's in heaven. Isn't that exactly what Ruth did? She saw in Naomi those characteristics. And as a result of that, she says, I'll go where you go, and your God is going to be my God. That was the attitude she had, and it was because of the kind of person that Naomi was. In Philippians, the 2nd chapter, in verse 15 and 16, Philippians 2, 15 and 16. Now, I just learned I was going to be preaching this morning, yesterday afternoon, and normally what I do, and most preachers do, is they will get on a computer and they will type up the scriptures they're going to read, and they're going to have them right there in front of them. And that makes it, you don't have a lot of preachers doing this and everything, which is fine. That's what they used to do. But that's the reason I'm kind of slow about this. But it says in verse 15, chapter 2 of Philippians 15, it says, that ye may become blameless and harmless, children of God, without blemish, in the midst of a crooked and perverse generation, among whom ye are seen as lights of the world, holding forth the word of life, that I may have whereof to glory in the day of Christ, that I did not run in vain, neither labor in vain. Paul says, this is the kind of person you need to be. You need to become a person in the world who is blameless. People can't go around pointing a finger at you and say, well, I see you did this, and oh, you did that, and it's something you shouldn't have done. Well, that's not real godlike, You ever had somebody say to, heard somebody say to someone, hope he didn't say it to you, well, that's not very Christ-like, or, well, somebody, and I always get a big kick out of an atheist saying to someone, well, that's not Christian. What's with that? You're not a Christian. You're not going. Don't tell me what a Christian is and what a Christian isn't. But Paul says we're to be blameless. We're to be Christians in this world, not having people being able to point a finger to us. Harmless, children of God without blemish in the world. A blemishment is a disfigurement. It might be small, it might be large, but it's a disfigurement on the body. That's a blemish. And we're not to be that kind of person in the world, to have a disfigurement of God. We're not to put forth an idea of God in this world that is not like the God of Scripture. We can't say we're Christians and be something else. That's what Paul's saying. You can't say you're Christian and be something else. You have, other than what God teaches a Christian is. You got to be without blemish in the midst of a crooked and perverse generation. That's where we live. We live in a world, we've talked about this several times in our Bible class, I think on Friday and Wednesday and so on. We live in a dual world. There is the natural and there's the spiritual. And we are the light and the world is in darkness. And we have to make sure that everybody understands that in the way we live. And he says that we are here among a crooked and perverse generation, but we're seen, he says, as lights of the world, holding forth the word of life. So we've got to be like Naomi. That's the kind of person she was, obviously, or Ruth wouldn't have followed her. In Philippians 2:15, no, that's what I just did. But it's a good thing to be like Naomi. And it's a great thing to be like Ruth, too. We need to be like both of them, not just one of them. We need to be like both of them. It's a good thing to be able to make the kind of decisions that Ruth made. She followed someone else. And we tend to do that. We tend to follow other people. But we have to follow the right people, don't we? We have to follow the right people. And that's what Ruth decided to do, to follow Naomi. It's a good thing to imitate the faithfulness in other people. In 1 Corinthians, the 11th chapter, 1 Corinthians 11, verse 1. Paul says, be ye imitators of me, even as I also am of Christ. That's a when you think about it, a fascinating thing. When you go to also into Philippians, again, back to Philippians, the 4th chapter, Paul says, be ye imitators of me, as also I am an imitator of Christ. He says, you imitate the good things in me, the things that are Christian in me. And in Philippians, the 4th chapter, verse 8 and 9, Paul says, finally, brethren, whatsoever things are true, whatsoever things are honorable, whatsoever things are just, whatsoever things are pure, whatsoever things are lovely, whatsoever things are of good report, if there be any virtue and if there be any praise, think on these things. The things, now listen, he talks about all these great things, and he says, you think on these things. Then he says, the things which you both learned and received and heard and saw in me. Well, what things? What things? Well, it's the things he just mentioned. That's the kind of person that Paul was. He says, you saw these things in me. You saw that there, you saw a purity there. You saw a loveliness there. You saw good report there. You saw virtue. You saw praise there. That's the things you saw in me. And he says, and the things which you both learned and received and heard and saw in me, these things do. He says, you imitate me. He says, and the God of peace shall be with you. Have you ever read that and thought, wait a minute, what a wonderful thing that Paul could say. He could have such confidence in his relationship with God and with Christ that he could say, you imitate me. And then to add to that, he's saying, if you do imitate me, then the God of peace will be with you. Wow. You got to have a lot of confidence in God and in Christ to do that, haven't you? That's faith there. That's a man who knew where he stood with God. It's a powerful, powerful message for us to be that kind of person where we could tell someone else, it'd be a good thing for you to imitate me. Now, we can't go wrong to imitate the good things in other people. This morning, when we leave this building, we are going to be a light of the world in one way or another. We're going to be a light of the world or a light to the world. Now, Naomi, she was obviously a light to Ruth. And she was separated from that world she lived in Moab, and the influences there. And we need to be like Naomi. We need to be an influence on other people. And we also, as we leave here, we need to be like Ruth. There are good people in the congregation, and we need to imitate their goodness and their good works and their love for God. There's nothing wrong with that. And we need to be like both of them as we leave this building this morning and we go out into the world. But the first thing, Naomi was not a Christian. She was a Jew under the law of Moses. But for us, that's not going to work. Neither is being just a good moral person in the world and then being a good moral influence to other people. That's not going to work either. We need to be children of God, first of all. If we're going to be an influence to anybody, that's the first thing. And this morning, if you're not a child of God, if you've never obeyed the gospel of Jesus Christ, this is a time to do it, an opportunity to do it, and to begin to be the kind of influence you ought to be in the world, that other people might follow your example. And if you are this morning a Christian and you haven't been that kind of influence, this is the time to make that right in your mind and make it right with God, an opportunity to do so. If there's anyone here this morning who's an opportunity or who needs to obey the gospel in any way, we'd urge you to come as we stand and sing.